Who is Loki? That's a question that should be easy to answer. After all, Loki has been one of the most popular villains in Marvel Studios' recent slate of films, starring the one and only Tom Hiddleston. And while Loki may have made a grand entrance into the modern pantheon with his very own series on Disney+, that wasn't where he came from. No, Loki comes from an older tradition of tales known as Norse paganism or heathenry. In fact, Loki is such a popular figure in the Norse myths that we have an overwhelming amount of stories featuring him. And the more we look at them, the more we can see just how complex this character really is. So join us as we count down 5 dark things about Loki that you didn't know. Number 5, Loki was a blood brother to Odin, not just a villain. Now, if you're familiar with Marvel Comics, then it's probably pretty easy to assume that Loki was always destined to become a villain. After all, he was born a frost giant, a sworn enemy of the Aesir, the race of gods that Loki eventually joined. In fact, Loki's mother, the giantess Angerboda, was literally the reason that his father, the equally giant Farbauti, started a war with the Aesir. See, Odin and his brothers slew their way through the frost giants, but when they got to Angerboda, he had her trapped in a magic bag and used his powers to turn her into a mare. When Farbauti tracked her down and demanded she come back with him, Odin intervened and made a proposition, one that would change the course of history forever. Odin offered to take Loki in as his foster son, raising him as one of the Aesir and giving him the title of the God of Mischief. But that came with one catch. To cement the bargain between them, Odin and Loki had to swear a blood oath. And you don't get much closer than that. The problem is that blood oaths were binding, and when Loki went back on his word, Odin was left with no choice but to enact their agreement. Yeah, Loki might be the god of lies, but he's also the god of honor. And Odin would soon learn that those two aren't always mutually exclusive. Number 4, he fathered monsters and a horse. Loki is probably best remembered as the father of monsters. We're talking about creatures like the Midgard serpent, the wolf Fenrir, and the terrifyingly beautiful goddess of death, Hela. In fact, all 3 of these children are the literal embodiments of doom and destruction. So who exactly was their mother? Well, the truth is that Loki sired children with many different lovers, some of whom were actually gods themselves. One of his most well-known affairs was with the goddess Sigyn, who he met while disguised as the god of wisdom, Kvasir. Their union bore him Narfi, who we already mentioned, as well as the monstrous serpent Jormungandr. But Loki didn't just make babies with deities. Oh no, he wooed mortals too. Remember that whole god of fire thing we mentioned? Well, he ended up setting his sights on a mortal woman named Thyre. And although their affair only lasted 3 nights, their union resulted in a new god, the trickster deity Bylist. And yes, we know it looks like he's producing children at a disturbing rate, but we assure you that it gets worse. There's also Sleipnir, Loki's 8-legged horse, which he brought into the world by seducing a giantess named Gunnelhide. So yeah, that happened. Number 3, his tricks often saved the gods, until they didn't. Loki might be a liar and a trickster, but throughout the various Norse myths, he often did the gods a favor. From helping Heimdall track down the legendary mead of poetry, to securing the release of Thor and his companions from the giantess Thrym, Loki consistently bails the other gods out of danger, and while he does demand compensation for his services, said compensation could be as simple as the promise of a night of entertainment. Unfortunately for Loki, though, the gods would eventually repay his kindnesses in kind and invite him to attend the funeral of Balder the Beautiful, something which Loki would immediately regret. As it turns out, one of Loki's tricks saved the entire Norse pantheon. While visiting the blind god Hoder, Loki made a bet that he could get the god to shoot an arrow at him without doing any damage. Obviously, Loki felt invincible, so he volunteered to be the target. But when Hoder fired, his arrow struck true, killing Loki and releasing all of the serpents he was keeping chained. Under his skin, naturally, the other gods were furious. And even though Loki tried to make amends, claiming that he could be resurrected, they refused to listen. Instead, they strung him up to a nearby tree and began to flay him. And you know what? It gets worse. Before they let him go, they put him on trial and forced him to swear an oath that he'd never do anything to harm them ever again. Naturally, Loki broke that oath the second he was free. And that brings us to our next point. 2. He will lead the armies of Ragnarök. Okay, so maybe we should dial back on the whole "he often saved the gods" thing. See, while Loki did perform heroic deeds, he also did a lot of harmful things, like kill Balder. In fact, he spent a great deal of time stirring up conflict, usually because he was bored. After all, what else is a god of trickery supposed to do? Well, unfortunately for everyone, he eventually found an outlet for his restless energy, a prophecy that foretold the end of the world. Known as Ragnarök, the event would bring about the death of most of the major gods, and Loki would lead the opposing army, consisting of giants, demons, undead warriors, and of course, his own children, all against the surviving Aesir, who would be led by Thor. If that sounds insane, that's because it is. But according to the Eddas, Loki is destined to do it. In fact, if there's anyone who's excited for Ragnarök, it's Loki. After all, it gives him a chance to break free from the shackles that bind him. More on that in a minute. And now, before we reveal the darkest truth of all, we want to give you a chance to show off your knowledge of Norse mythology. Test your skills with our quiz. Noma 1, he's bound in pain. Until the end of the world. For those of you who might not be aware, Loki wasn't just flayed once. In fact, the gods did that to him twice. And after the second time, they decided to add some extra punishment. They tied him up with chains, bound him to a rock, and threw him into a cave guarded by venomous snakes. And why, you ask? Well, Loki was getting a little bit too powerful, thanks to his shape-shifting abilities. In fact, he became so powerful that Odin couldn't even see him anymore. Something had to be done. And since punishing him was their favorite pastime, they decided to throw him in jail. Yeah, it sounds awful. And it gets worse. Once he settled in, the gods turned him into a fly so that he could suffer for eternity. But Loki being Loki, he escaped and returned to his old ways. But hey, karma's a real thing, am I right? Sure enough, when Ragnarök arrives, the giant serpent Jormungand will find Loki and bite him on the neck. And if you thought being stung by a venomous snake was painful, try being bitten by a giant serpent that circles the entire earth. In fact, the venom is so powerful that it kills Loki instantly, except for a small problem. Since he's bound to the rock, his body inflates until his veins burst and the blood pours out, resulting in the death of all life on Earth. Ironic. Hey, thanks for watching, everyone. Which dark secret surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.